Beneath the grandeur of towering temples and vast reservoirs lay a quiet unraveling. The very earth that nurtured the Khmer Empire began to turn against it. Rivers that once coursed like lifeblood through the jungles slowed and shriveled. Reservoirs cracked open like ancient wounds, and the skies withheld rain as if in silent judgment. This was no mere inconvenience. It was a slow poison seeping into the veins of an empire built on water and war. The armies that once marched unchallenged across Southeast Asia found their strength sapped not only by enemy steel, but by an unforgiving environment that turned fertile lands into deserts and calm rivers into death traps. In this shadowed era, survival depended not only on weapons but on rituals whispered to the gods, desperate prayers cast into the dying wind. The Empire's mighty war machines faltered as famine and disease marched hand in hand with invading forces. This is the story of how nature's invisible siege shattered an empire's power, a tale of decay, desperation, and the haunting echoes of an empire's last stand against forces both human and elemental. This is the impact of environmental changes on Khmer military strength. Part 1. The waning waters, climate, drought, and the collapse of supply lines. The vastness of the Khmer Empire once echoed with the thunder of armies and the flowing pulse of water. The twin forces that gave life and death to a civilization forged in the dense jungles and sprawling plains of Southeast Asia. Rivers being the empire's lifeblood, the arteries that carried sustenance, trade, and soldiers. The mighty Mekong and tonal sap flooded in rhythmic cycles, filling reservoirs that fed crops and quenched the thirst of countless warriors. But in the shadows of the 14th century, that rhythm faltered. The waters waned, receding like a heartbeat slowing before final silence. A creeping drought settled over the land, relentless and unforgiving, unseen yet deadlier than any invading army. The people of Angkor had long mastered the art of water management. They built intricate networks of canals, barrays and reservoirs, monumental feats of engineering that tamed nature's fury. These lifelines supported sprawling cities, vast rice fields, and armies whose strength depended on the abundance of grain and clean water. But the climate was shifting, turning against them in subtle but devastating ways. Rainfall patterns grew erratic. Dry seasons stretched into unending months, scorching the earth beneath searing suns. The barrays that once brimmed with life turned into cracked basins, the canal waters stagnant and choked with silt. Without water, the fertile soil hardened into dust, and the paddy fields shriveled to barren patches. This was not a sudden calamity, but a slow unraveling, a dark tide that crept unnoticed beneath the splendor of temples and palaces. The rulers of Angkor, proud and unyielding, sent envoys to the gods, ordered ceremonies to bring rain, but the skies remained mute. Crops failed in silent fields. Food supplies dwindled, sending shockwaves through the empire's military heart. Armies that had once roamed freely faced starvation before the clash of swords. The supply lines intricate chains of men, animals, and riverboats laden with rice, weapons, and armor began to fracture. Where once the empire's power surged like a tidal wave, it now faltered, vulnerable and exposed. The canals and rivers that were once highways for swift military movements grew unreliable. Drought transformed waterways into shallow traps, stranding vessels and cutting off vital reinforcements. Without the steady flow of food and water, the soldiers' morale withered faster than their bodies. Disease found easy prey among the weakened ranks, and desertion became a silent plague within the camps. Commanders grappled with dwindling resources and mounting fears, knowing that an army cannot fight if its lifeblood is stolen by nature itself. Behind the scenes of war, the common people endured their own battle for survival. Villages faced hunger and thirst, the fertile fields they depended on turning against them like a cruel trick of fate. Ancient rituals to honor the rain gods became desperate acts of devotion, as shamans and priests sought to pierce the veil of silence that hung heavy over the skies. Amidst fear and uncertainty, tales spread of angry spirits in cursed lands, whispers that the empire's once harmonious relationship with nature had been shattered by arrogance and neglect. The drought did not merely threaten food supplies, it altered the very terrain where battles had been fought for generations. Soft earth hardened into cracked, uneven ground, unsuitable for the swift movement of cavalry and elephant troops. Dense forests receded, replaced by parched clearings, changing the landscape of war. Fortresses that relied on natural water defenses found their moats empty and their walls exposed. Siege tactics once honed in the jungles became obsolete, leaving armies vulnerable to new forms of attack. In this shifting geography, commanders struggled to adapt, caught in a relentless struggle against both human enemies and the merciless environment. The ripple effects extended beyond the battlefield. Trade routes along the rivers faltered as ports dried and boats stranded. Economic hardship tightened its grip, draining the coffers that funded armies and built temples. The loss of wealth deepened the empire's vulnerabilities, turning one's loyal allies into restless factions hungry for power. Political instability surged beneath the surface, shadows lengthening over a kingdom whose foundations were eroding like the riverbanks themselves. Amidst this chaos, stories of resilience flickered like fragile flames in the dark. Some commanders sought to innovate, redirecting scarce water supplies with daring engineering projects, or shifting military campaigns to regions less afflicted by drought. The people adapted their diets and rituals, turning to lesser-known foods and holding ceremonies to appease spirits believed to control the elements. But each act of survival was a grim reminder of the empire's diminishing grip on its destiny. The waning waters carved scars into the empire's soul. Ancient inscriptions and carvings began to speak not only of victories but of losses to invisible forces. The gods once believed to bless the Khmer armies seemed distant, their silence echoing louder than any war cry. As the rivers dried and the land cracked, the empire's might ebbed like the retreating tide, leaving behind a haunting question. Could even the greatest warriors triumph against the slow march of environmental collapse? This was a world where the clash of steel was rivaled by the clash of elements, where battles were fought not just between armies but between civilization and nature itself. The Khmer Empire's military strength was not solely the product of strategy or bravery, but a delicate balance held in the palm of the skies and the flow of waters. When that balance shattered, the empire faced a reckoning that no sword could delay. As dusk fell over parched fields and empty reservoirs, the silent siege of drought continued, invisible yet all-consuming. The soldiers who marched once with certainty now faced uncertainty, carved by cracked earth and barren horizons. The empire's fate lay tangled in the veins of rivers that no longer ran, in the prayers whispered to forgotten gods, and in the relentless heat that scorched the land and hearts alike. This was the beginning of the end for Khmer military might, a dark chapter written not in blood alone, but in dust and despair. Part 2. Shadows over the battlefield, survival, rituals, and resistance amidst environmental ruin. The relentless grip of drought had stripped the Khmer Empire bare, but the story of its warriors and people was not merely one of collapse and despair. Beneath the dying skies and cracked earth, life clung stubbornly to the ruins, shaped by a fierce will to survive and resist. The battlefield transformed into a haunting landscape where war was no longer only fought with blade and bow, but with prayers, rituals, and raw human endurance. As the empire's waters receded, so too did the certainty of power, replaced by shadows that whispered of unseen enemies and the relentless toll of nature's fury. Survival became an act of defiance. Soldiers, once confident in their ranks, now found themselves scavenging what little remained. Fields that once fed armies lay fallow, forcing communities to forage in the forests for roots, insects, and the rare game that still roamed the dying wilderness. Food became currency as much as weapons, and the bond between warrior and peasant tightened under the strain of scarcity. Villagers adapted ancient customs to honor the land that no longer gave freely, offering rituals meant to coax life from the barren soil. Fires burned longer into the night as shamans chanted in smoky temples, their voices rising in desperate supplication to gods whose favor seemed lost. The rivers, once mighty highways of war and trade, became spectral boundaries between survival and oblivion. Riverine warfare, once a hallmark of Khmer strategy, dwindled as water levels fell. Fleets of swift warboats, adorned with fierce carvings of serpents and deities, were left grounded in silt and mud. Commanders redirected their efforts inland, but the land was unforgiving. Guerrilla tactics emerged, small bands of fighters moving silently through the scorched forests and fractured villages, relying on knowledge of the terrain and the shadows to strike and vanish. Resistance took new forms, less about conquest and more about holding on, protecting what little remained of a way of life threatened by drought and decay. Amidst this backdrop, the old rituals gained renewed urgency. The Khmer believed that their fate was bound to the gods and the forces of nature. When waters receded, priests and kings alike turned to ceremonies designed to restore balance. Sacred offerings of rice, incense, and animal sacrifices were made along the edges of the barriers, where cracked earth betrayed the promise of past abundance. Music and dance filled the temples in nocturnal vigils, each movement a plea for mercy from the skies. The elite warriors carried talismans and invoked blessings before battle, hoping to shield themselves from not just the enemy but the pervasive threat of famine and disease that stalked their camps like a hidden predator. Yet the relentless environmental decline bred desperation. The social fabric strained as shortages bred mistrust. Some communities turned inward, guarding their meager supplies with suspicion, while others fell prey to marauding bands that roamed the drylands in search of plunder. Within the military, commanders struggled to maintain discipline as starvation and sickness eroded morale. Reports from the front lines spoke of mutinies and desertions. Shadows growing longer not just from the setting sun, but from the weakening bonds of loyalty. The very idea of empire seemed to crumble beneath the weight of nature's silent siege. In the shadow of the fortress walls and deserted temples, the human spirit was tested. Families clung to fading memories of abundance, recalling feasts and festivals that once defined their lives. Mothers told children stories of great warriors who tamed rivers and commanded the skies. Stories meant to inspire courage in a time when hope flickered like a dying flame. But the reality was, harsher life was a daily battle against hunger, thirst, and despair. Diseases like malaria and dysentery spread rapidly in cramped villages and military camps, feeding on the weakened bodies of those who survived the battlefield. Death was not only a consequence of war, but a constant companion in this new era of environmental ruin. Amidst the decay, there were glimpses of resistance beyond the battlefield. Some communities experimented with new agricultural techniques, attempting to eke out crops from the parched earth. Others migrated toward remaining water sources, forging tenuous alliances with neighboring groups. Trade adapted, with goods flowing along altered routes that skirted dry riverbeds and broken roads. These acts of survival were quiet revolts against the encroaching darkness, a refusal to surrender completely to the forces threatening to consume the empire. The rulers of Angkor faced impossible choices. The grand temples and palaces that once symbolized divine power became reminders of a fading glory. Resources that once funded military campaigns were redirected toward sustaining the population and preserving the fragile infrastructure of water management. Yet even these efforts often faltered under the relentless pressure of drought and societal strain. Political fractures widened as regional leaders seized power amid the chaos, and internal conflicts further weakened the empire's ability to respond to external threats. War, in this era, became a shadow play. Armies moved cautiously, aware that the true enemy was not always visible. Battles were fought not only against invading forces, but against the slow collapse of the very environment that sustained them. Fortifications crumbled as foundations dried and cracked. Supply lines that depended on water faltered. The once proud Khmer navy was reduced to scattered remnants, unable to project power on the rivers that fed the empire. The cycle of siege and resistance took on new meaning, as survival depended on mastering a landscape that had turned hostile, on rituals to placate indifferent gods, and on the unyielding will of people determined to endure. As the sun set over parched plains and empty waterways, the Khmer Empire stood at a crossroads between memory and oblivion. The impact of environmental change was no longer a distant threat, but a lived reality etched into the bones of the land and the stories of its people. The legacy of their struggle was not just in the ruins left behind, but in the enduring spirit that resisted extinction. The warriors who once commanded mighty fleets and armies had become shadows moving through a world transformed, their battles marked by hunger and hope alike. The empire's fate was sealed, not by sword or siege, but by the slow, inexorable march of nature, reclaiming what had been wrested from it. In the quiet moments between raids and rituals, the people of Khmer whispered prayers for rain, for strength, and for the endurance of a civilization hanging by the slenderest thread. The shadows over the battlefield were long, but within them burned a stubborn flame of resistance that refused to be extinguished. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.